All right, hello, can you hear me? Yep, excellent. So I'll just do a few things in setup before we get started. So this debate is breastfeeding in public should not be considered appropriate or offensive. First thing I want to note is that this is not a policy debate, which means that we are not actually proposing like any strict piece of government policy. This isn't about a law. This is kind of about debating about what should be in the collective unconscious of people, and then evaluating the likelihood of their responses and the impact those responses have on people. What I will be pointing to is, first of all, why I think this ought to be offensive in principle. Secondly, why I think the personal responses this is likely to incite will lead to harm mothers and their children. And then lastly, why I think the sort of policy responses this is likely to incite will also harm mothers and their children. And then hopefully later on in the debate, if necessary, I will defend why they are the most important people to look after. So first thing, why in principle should not be offensive. As far as I can tell, the only thing offensive about this is the fact that there's some light nudity involved, right? Which is to say that if you're just bottle feeding a baby, no one would care. The only thing here about breastfeeding in public is the fact that there is a breast involved. So it's like really softcore nudity, which is getting people offended. What I would say here is that we tolerate softcore nudity in public all of the time, right? There's sexualized advertising. There's movies and huge billboards. There's even like businesses which pride themselves on this sort of thing, right? Like Hooters. So it seems crazy to me that a society which in so many other ways tolerates it would then not tolerate it when it's nursing a baby. That seems wrong. But also, even if you don't buy that, there's other reasons as well. Contextually, we appreciate nudity all the time. So, for example, in public pools or in beaches, partial nudity is already considered not offensive when it would be if you were to, for example, walk into a church or walk into like some other more formal context with it. And even like other things to do with pregnancy. Like, how often do you think it is that people roll up their shirts and press each other's ears to their stomachs? It would be really weird. But when pregnancy is involved, it's not, because we recognize that it's for a different purpose. It is not erotic. It is not intended to be arousing. It is just a normal function of being pregnant. And I reckon that that breastfeeding in public should be considered in exactly the same way. It's not intended to be erotic. It's not intended to be arousing. It is one of those activities which if the person wasn't pregnant, would be a little bit weird. But because it is pregnant, it should be totally okay. And also, let's point to as well that the method by which you breastfeed is not erotic either, right? Like the baby, the baby's mouth is presumably covering the nipple. It's not like the mother's getting fully undressed. Like if anything, women have a pretty strong incentive to keep this as discreet as possible. But the fact of the matter is that if you've got a crying baby who is hungry, you don't want to go searching for the nearest available toilet which has sanitary conditions. You want to be feeding them now to relieve them of stress, and that's why it shouldn't be considered in public offensive or rude in public. I'll break into my next two contentions after I hear from my opponent.
All right, I'm going to get straight into it because I got a lot to cover. Contention 1, we have the right to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom of speech. A, when Thomas Jefferson crafted the Declaration of Independence, he pointed to certain unalienable rights which we were endowed by our Creator. Jefferson understood unalienable rights as fixed rights given to us by our Creator rather than by our government. Subpoint B, our laws show things that are appropriate at times and not others. For example, murder is illegal, but the death penalty is sometimes seen appropriate. Appropriateness is always evolving and changing. Contention 2, link, affirmative plan depletes these rights. A, the affirmative in the resolution is not affirming anything legal. They are strictly affirming that an individual should be believing that something is inappropriate or offensive. Subpoint B, by doing this, the affirmative is trying to set a parameter for all individuals on what should and should not be considered appropriate or offensive. Subpoint C, the affirmative is setting a slippery slope that one person should be able to decide what the masses believe is offensive, inappropriate based on the thoughts of beliefs of one person. Contention 3, impacts. Impact 1, dictatorship and communism ensues. A dictator is a government where absolute power and decisions are made by one person. Dictatorship leads to death, slavery, oppression of opinion, speech, and lifestyle. According to an article from listverse.com, the impacts of the 10 dictators, we see the following 2 test cases. Test case 1, China. More than 200,000 Chinese are serving re-education and performs more than 4,000 executions every year. Many of them are for non-violent crimes deriving from expressing their thoughts or opinions. Test case 2, Zimbabwe. According to Amnesty International, in 2002 alone, Mugabe's government killed or tortured 70,000 people for not following his rule. Impact 2, social movement and progressions exist because of the freedom of speech, expression, and thought. Freedom of speech and thought leads to progression. Scenario 1, civil rights movement. Because of people like Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks who had the freedom of speech and freedom of thought to be able to speak out loud or against oppression, we saw equal rights come regardless of color. Scenario 2, same same-sex marriages and sexual orientation. If freedom of thought as expression is dictated by one person, as the affirmative is saying, others that live different lives will not be able to exist. Contention 4, alternatives. Alternative 1, reject the resolution. It is the mindset the resolution calls for that one person, the affirmative, can say what others should feel and think. That leads to these impacts and needs to be rejected. Alternative 2, provide alternatives for everyone. In the case of breastfeeding, an article from The Guardian entitled Expecting Mothers and Social Acceptance, it says 1/3 of new mothers are not comfortable breastfeeding in public and feel socially awkward, preferring a place to do it privately. In this case, we need to provide alternatives to make all comfortable, like accessible nursing rooms. Basically, what I'm saying is the affirmative, by affirming, he is saying all should believe one thing. When this happens, we see the following impacts. I give alternatives that can stop that from happening.
Alrighty. So the first thing I'll address is that I think you might have misinterpreted the debate. Debates about should not be considered appropriate or offensive is not like me invading the minds of everyone and telling them what they should think. It's just qualitatively assessing whether it would be net positive or net negative if people thought this. So like the first intuitive reason you should believe this is true is that how many, do you really think that if everyone stopped finding this offensive, we'd slip into a dictatorship? And judges and audience, clearly just think about this, right? There are lots of institutions which already try to influence people's thoughts, like churches. Does the presence of a church, even though it encourages people to find certain things inappropriate or offensive or certain things permissible, automatically lead to an autocracy? No, it doesn't, right? So that's not really what the debate's about. But it's also not about freedom and rights either, because it's not about, this isn't a government policy debate. This isn't the government telling you that if you think this thing, you will go to jail. So you can still, I can, on my side of the house, say, look, people can find this offensive if they want, but I just don't think they should. And that's still me confirming my part of the resolution. I'm saying that it would be better if people didn't find it offensive, and they ought not, in principle, find it offensive. The first thing I'll do is just remind the audience that I gave a pretty clear, principled, logical reason based on people's current behaviors around the way in which they find other forms of nudity non-offensive, and the way they find other behaviors surrounding pregnancy to be exceptions to otherwise offensive things, which hasn't been responded to. So at this stage of the debate, in principle, you should not find this offensive. Second thing I'm going to talk about is about the personal consequences. Personal consequences are going to be that if it is seen that there's a lot of people who find this offensive, mothers will find this embarrassing, right? They're going to be humiliated and embarrassed to do it in public, which means that they're likely going to go for the sort of alternative options my opponent talked about. Problem is that alternative options are not well funded in a lot of cases. And a lot of businesses, for example, where this mostly happens, and you can just look up online, breastfeeding mother kicked out of X. It's mostly in cafes which don't have the facilities. They're not large shopping malls. They don't have the resources to have, sanitary breastfeeding rooms. And they're kicked out because another customer is uncomfortable. What this leads to is two things. One, it either leads to mothers and their babies being more uncomfortable in public than they otherwise would have to be. And I value the comfort of mothers over the comfort of people who just can't, bring it upon themselves to avert their eyes. But secondly, that it leads to people doing things like bottle feeding their babies sooner, right? Because they want their babies to be fed at the point which they are hungry. And that is bad for the baby's health, right? Ask any pharmacist or any doctor. And they'll tell you that breast is best for a long time, and that's because the nutrients in a mother's breast milk are superior to that of bottle. So what this does personally is it makes mothers uncomfortable, and it leads them to make choices about parenting their children, which are in the end worse for their children's health. Which is why is another reason which you should alleviate the offensiveness so that they don't feel embarrassed anymore.
Okay, so let's get into this specifically, and we're going to get into his case a little, but I want to get into mine. First, he says that I'm misinterpreting the debate. One, no, I'm not. It specifically says that he's affirming that the public should consider this not consider it offensive or inappropriate. At the point where he is affirming that, he is specifically saying that all people should think this way. He cannot garner the fact that only half or whatever. To win the debate, he is saying that everyone should believe this way. For that to happen, you see the links and the impacts of this situation coming. Things like slavery, things that these started with one person telling people this is how it can go. Adolf Hitler and his rise and his regime and his dictatorship all started from one person saying that. He specifically links into that. Then he says that there's other things that happen because of The church has the presence. It doesn't happen. One, that's not true. Churches have cult followings all the time, but just because it's there and they believe the source that it comes to. And then his third argumentation on this is that this is not a government. This is not a policy. Exactly. We're debating in the accent of a mindset. So he's not authoritating anything. He's trying to change a mindset. At that point, he links directly. He doesn't talk about how my 3 linked argumentations that show this happens and creates the slippery slope. So my impacts go. He also doesn't talk about my alternatives, but I do want to get into his case. One, he says, why not? And he goes into nudity. My first response on this is going to be religion. For some, it's inappropriate because of the aspect of, like, Muslims say that we shouldn't look at a woman's body at all. That's why we do raps, we do things like that. So one, religion, it is inappropriate for those. Again, ties back into my case if you can't say what's appropriate for one and what's not appropriate for the other. Two, he says that it's not erotic in any way. We see nudity, but actually there's a category on Pornhub that talks about lactating. So there is an erotic situation that's gone into this. People actually watch this and do get aroused by the access of a lactating person. Then he goes to the lead to harms. A couple things I want to talk about this. One, he specifically says things about funding and those things, but he said this isn't a policy debate, so funding shouldn't come in. It's just whether this should or shouldn't happen. And the fact where funding should not come into play, we're not debating whether it can happen, we're debating whether it should. Look to my alternative of nursing rooms, and that's a main reason it should happen. We should be giving people options to be appropriate if they choose to go. Look to the statistic about 1/3 of the women feel uncomfortable doing this in public as new mothers. We should give them the situation. We can't talk about money. We're not talking about policy. He agreed with that. Then he talked about bottle feeding not being healthy. There is an invention called the breast pump now, where you can actually pump your own milk and use that at other times. Again, I'm not saying it should or shouldn't be inappropriate. I'm just saying we need to give options to all. That is not shown under the case where he can do that and does have that alternative. I'm going to pass the mic back to you to go into your third contention because I feel like I've come.
Okay, first thing, I'm going to address this slippery slope into totalitarian dictatorships. First thing is first, right? If it really was about one mind colonizing, you haven't actually shown the link to Hitler or Mao's China. And the reason for that is that those are clearly examples of where the state was imposing what could be thought and what not could be thought, which is what I told you about. This is not a policy debate. The government is not outlawing things. There is no penalty for going to jail. So those links are completely fallacious. Second thing you said is that, look, you can't say what's appropriate and what's not. Everyone's got their own, opinion. This errs very dangerously into cultural relativism. I don't think it is appropriate to, for example, genitally mutilate people as children. And I don't think it's appropriate that the West should be governed under, for example, totalitarian dictatorships. But your stance would say, no, that's just an opinion. You should find, maybe democracy offensive. This is not a debate about, obviously we can say that some opinions are better than others. It is my position in the debate, the opinion that just live and let living and let people breastfeeding in public is better than one which says that, no, you want people to take it to a nursing room and keep it out of your eye. That is what the debate is about. Second thing you were saying, well, look, there's a section on Pornhub called lactating, which I have pre-responded to in my first point. The section on Pornhub about lactating never involves babies. It is performed erotically and is completely different to breastfeeding in public, which is a functional task which doesn't sexualize the mother in any way. It is for the purpose of feeding children. The next thing I'll do is quickly readdress my personal consequences. The first thing which I'm going to point out there is that I did respond to your statistic, right? What if 1/3 of mothers feel uncomfortable in public? Why do you think that might be? Maybe it's because of what I talked about. That there is this norm out there that people will jeer at them and ask them to, to go to a private room. That is what makes those mothers feel uncomfortable. So if you want more mothers to feel comfortable caring for their children, then you ought vote in favor of this policy. And similarly, the stuff about alternatives I addressed as well. They're not financially viable for a lot of businesses. Many businesses don't have the facilities for them. And also it still is less convenient for the mother to have to move away from their conversation. Okay, last thing is policy responses. I think the way this is likely to be responded to in cafes and things is when customers complain, they are likely to do things like say, well, look, no, ask mothers to leave, ask mothers to do that somewhere else. And what that means ultimately is that it means that the mother is will be very stressed and very uncomfortable. Because I want you to put yourselves in the position of someone who's caring for a child, right? Maybe you're shopping, maybe you're incredibly busy. There are a lot of things on your mind, particularly if you're a new mother, maybe even finances are on your mind. What that means is at the point where your baby starts crying, I think that the process of feeding them should be as easy as possible. You shouldn't have to worry if there's a security guard looking at you. You shouldn't have to worry if someone's going to ask you to leave the store, because then what are you going to do with all that shopping which you haven't paid for yet? What if the nursing room is really dirty and inappropriate for your child, right? There are lots of reasons as to why you should want this to be as easy as possible for the mother, and that's why you should vote this motion.
Okay, getting back into it, going back to my argumentation first, he gives several specific, and he says, one, that this isn't about a mind controlling and there's no links. Again, look to my link scenarios that say that we set a parameter for this to happen. It all starts from one opinion. He says it's a government situation, yes, but that starts from one opinion. The point behind the argumentation is the fact that he cannot say what everyone else should and should not consider inappropriate. And I've shown that through his case also, that we need to make it an open situation for people to judge and give options for them to be able to go, options to be respectful. Does that mean they take it? No, but we're giving them the options and we're not linking into it. Even the government, the Hitler, all those things, it all started from one person. We look to the China and the Zimbabwe case, it came from one person. Whether they be in government or not, it was one person's situation. This is allowing that mindset to be okay. Going on to his case, one, he goes to the Pornhub situation and he says that links back. And he said it wasn't erotic. Again, this goes to the situation if he can't say what's erotic. If they find lactating erotic, even whether it's a baby or not involved, he can't say what one individual finds to be sexual. He can't warrant that and claim that situation because that's for the individual to say, hey, I'm turned on by that or I'm not. Whether it's gross, whether it's offensive, that's fine. They have that right to be turned on by whatever they want to be turned on by in that nature. So the Pornhub goes. 2, on his lead to harm situation, he talks about improper parenting. 1, this is a direct turn on the case because to other people, again, it might be inappropriate to show a boob no matter what it is for. The religion argumentation where it is inappropriate to happen that. And they don't want to raise their children to know that that's okay. They don't think it's appropriate. So there could be bad parenting on both sides of this debate and in both situations, which is why we need to let everyone else decide and raise their family on what's appropriate for them and not tell them what to do. 3, he goes into the policy response and he says, onto my analysis of the 1/3, he says, why do they think it? It's because they're being asked out. No, again, part of this is the warranty. They just don't want to, they're uncomfortable showing their boob in public. They're uncomfortable taking their breast out in public and letting that happen. He can't say that my statistic specifically happens because of that. It's other reasons that come in. It has nothing to do with the social society. And even if it's their case, it's their right to do that. And that can happen whether they're 16 and have a child, 25 and have a child. There's many reasons they could have that stereotype. Onto his policy response, he says that the ease and the lack of parenting to be able to do that. 1, he specifically ignores my breast pump situation. It shows that there are other ways to do this that won't have that policy come around. 2, he specifically says the funding situation again. He cannot use funding as an example when we're not talking about policy. He says that in his beginning. We're saying on whether he should or shouldn't. He said that nursing rooms are a good idea. They're just not fundingly possible. We're not talking about the possibility. We're talking about whether it should happen. That shows that nursing rooms are an alternative and should happen.
Okay, first thing I'll address is this totalitarianism stuff. If it is your contention that if we allow any one opinion to influence another opinion, that will inevitably slide into fascist Hitler, then why is it that churches have not made America turn into fascism, right? Like, the whole point of living in a society is that you should be allowed to have your opinions and also be allowed to influence other people with your opinions. I might even point to this forum we are engaging in is debate, right? Where we are pushing each other's opinions on each other and trying to, use logic and reason and whatnot. That is exactly what we are doing here, right? So, and this won't slide into dictatorship. All I'm saying is that it would be net positive if people held the opinion that breastfeeding shouldn't be considered inappropriate or offensive. And I'm giving logical reasons as to why they ought not think that way. So I just really don't understand how any of this causality happens. You also haven't addressed that all of your examples are about state imposed control, but they're not about individuals thinking things. Okay. Second thing I'll address is your thing about 1/3 of mothers. Okay. The first thing I'd say is that you said, look, that 1/3 is a minority, right? Like I'm in the majority here. But secondly, you're like, oh, that opinion has nothing to do with society. How do you know it has nothing to do with society? The idea that 1/3 of people are uncomfortable, but that has nothing to do with other people whatsoever. That seems like a pretty wild claim, which is completely, without any evidence. What I would ask you is this: is it more likely that if they felt they would be more accepted outside, would more of them feel comfortable? And I think that's a pretty strong yes, just on the balance of probabilities. Next thing was the thing about erotic. Okay, so look, I'm not saying that people shouldn't find it erotic. You can find things erotic in public if you want. Like people with foot fetishes, right? Find bare feet erotic. That doesn't mean that, that they have to find them offensive, right? Like, oh, how dare you wear sandals, right? Because if I see toes, that really gets me going. They can find it erotic all they want. I'm just saying they shouldn't be offended by it and shouldn't say because of their personal sexual eroticism that they should impose, inappropriateness on other people. That's where the real fascism comes from, if you're wondering. Okay, but the last thing is about alternatives with the breast pump and stuff like that. The problem is that what you haven't realized is that how does a cafe on a beach implement a feeding room, right? How does a shoe store implement a feeding room? It's just not practical for lots of people. And that's the same for personal alternatives like breast pumps, right? Breast pumps cost actually quite a bit of money. You need to clean them and get new suction things on them or whatever. And it's also time consuming in the middle of the day. What at the end of the day this means is that lots of people can't afford them, lots of people don't like them, lots of people actually enjoy the experience of nursing their babies and just wish that they could do it, in public as well as in private. So all of those things are not accessible to a large amount of people, and that is why it makes life more difficult for mothers and worse for children when it didn't have to be.
Okay, going back to this whole argument that I still think stands on my negative case. One, he says, why does this churches not happen? One, churches don't force anything on anyone. It's an invitation they offer. They present their case and say, would you like to follow? They don't force people into their doors. They don't force things to happen. By affirming the resolution, you're specifically saying that breastfeeding in public should not be considered inappropriate or offensive. You're saying that everyone should think this situation. If you affirm this resolution, you are saying a blanket situation should do that, and that's derived from the opinions and the case set by the affirmative. This sets the slippery slope into sale. He says it's not an individual situation. One, look to the Rosa Parks, look to the Martin Luther. I did give specific situations. Look to the gay rights situation that I did. I did show how individuals can do progress, and by stopping those individuals from speaking, stops the progress from happening. Churches give invitations. In this debate, the judges make a decision on two sides. We are saying one side, at the end of the day, all should consider inappropriate or offensive. So the link of the churches doesn't sit because there's not a force to go to the church. Even as a child, if you say that the child's forced to go to church, when they're an adult, they make their own decisions. Going on to the situation of the autoerotic versus offensive. One, foot fetishes, some people do find that offensive. Like they're like, oh my gosh, that's gross, that's disgusting, that offends me, that's inappropriate for you to have a foot fetish. Yes, they're entitled to that situation, but people are offended by the fact that these people have these erotic situations. So that is definitely an offense, and eroticism does happen, and you see them in the debate. Again, that's the appropriateness of their decision to decide, and the other person to think that that's offensive from their nature, but it still sits in this specific debate, and it still goes. On to the leading to harm. I don't feel like he touched a lot of my response on that in this specific one. We talked about the whole parenting and being bad on one stand, and that goes untouched. Going into his last speech, for him to bring that up now is kind of hard for him to do, but I said that the parenting could be bad when you're saying, hey, look at this boob, look at the situation, and some people don't want that to see that. The religion context goes untouched. Then we go into the policy situation. One, he says that the policy resumes. One on my things, he says that it's the money and the cost. How would places on beaches, how would shoe stores be able to have the feeding rooms? My first argument on this is they're able to have bathrooms. At the point where you're able to have bathrooms, you can have an extra room that's separate is for the feeding room. We're not saying, again, whether it could happen. We're saying whether it should happen. He said at the beginning that policy shouldn't happen, so you should not take funding into the situation. This isn't a debate on how we do it. It's a debate on should we do it. He's given no reason to why we shouldn't do it. Second, on the breast pump situation, again, he says cost and time. We're not debating the fact on whether this could happen. We're debating on whether it should. Is this an alternative that's conservative and able to happen? I've given you two specific reasons. Don't give him the non-policy debate if you're going to give him the situation on the fact that he can talk about this in the aspect of a probability of funding in those situations. That's a contradiction you cannot grant.
Okay, first thing, you've figured it out. The difference is force. But as I said at the beginning of the debate, this is not a policy debate. This is not the government making certain thoughts illegal, so there is no force. How on earth am I going to force anything on anyone? This is simply the metric, and I guess judges, you can decide what's more reasonable. Metric is this. I'm simply saying if people thought this way, it would be better overall. That's all. I'm not saying that, I'm going to invade the minds and force people, right? And so, how would I? How would I get in people's head and force them to think things? But also, just the other reason, this would be an incredibly generic response. That means that we actually would not be allowed to have debates anymore, which say X should not be considered offensive, because then the generic negative argument would always just be, how dare you ever say something should not be considered offensive? I've given logical reasons about why we tolerate other forms of nudity in public, which weren't responded to. I've given reasons to why things around pregnancy create exceptions, which wasn't responded to. And that is a logical reason why people ought not feel this way. And I've given reasons as to why it will be better for everyone. Okay, so some stuff he said. He said that some parents don't want their kids to see it. Okay, avert your eyes. Just don't point it out. You know, well, you can just avert your eyes if you really want. You don't have to find it offensive that it's happening. You can just say, well, it's like, you know, it's private. You know, like, well, it's not private. You know, but it's like, so it's rude to stare, right? You know, like some people, like it's rude to stare generically in public. You know what I mean? But that doesn't mean it's offensive that people, you know, can be stared at. Next thing, you're like, they can have bathrooms and breast pumps, and you bring up this should-could dichotomy. This is a misunderstanding of how the debate works. I can say, right, that as a result of people thinking a certain way, some things are more or less likely to happen, and some things are possible and impossible. So, for example, it's impossible at a cafe, which, you know, you said they have bathrooms. Many of them don't. It's impossible for a small street cafe, which doesn't even have a customer bathroom, to facilitate a feeding room. It is not possible for those rooms to, for example, not be cramped enough that one would actually feel comfortable nursing their child there. It is not possible for those things to happen. So this is not a could-should scenario. This is simply a result of, if people thought this way, and if customers complained, right, and people felt, man, we should have a breeding room, is it possible for them to respond in a certain way? And what I'm saying is that it is not possible for a poor family to conjure up money for a breast pump. It is not possible for a store which can barely facilitate a bathroom to conjure up room for a feeding room. Okay, so it's not a could-should scenario. It is simply, given that people think in a certain way, what is the likely result? And the likely result is this. Lots of mothers who are currently under the exact tyranny which you're worried about, right, feel uncomfortable outside because of the way other people think about them, feel uncomfortable feeding in case another customer complains, are doing things like bottle feeding their child because it's cheaper than breast pumping them. They're doing things like getting really stressed out and not feeding their child, and they're carrying around babies, and that is stressing them out. It's worse for the mother and worse for the child. That, at the end of the day, is what this debate is about. And if you want to provide a situation where mothers are well off and children are well off, then you will vote in favor of this motion.
Okay, going back onto this situation, one, he says the debates wouldn't happen with this mindset. One, that's not true. He could, talk about how communism is good. He could talk about different situations in where authoritarian is good. That's a debate that happens on several debate circuits and several debate situations. He could debate that that's happening. Two, he's saying that he does not have the power individually. No, but that's the mindset that he's affirming. And at the point where you vote for him, you're affirming this mindset that should happen among all people. So at the point where you vote that, you automatically catch into the link of the fact that he is advocating that all people should think this way. One, I've never advocated that people shouldn't think it's inappropriate. People shouldn't think it is appropriate. I've said we should have options and availabilities to all. And at the point where you limit that by one person, it's not going to happen. He does not successfully talk about the link scenario. Two, I want to talk about, he never talks about the appropriateness is always evolving with the death penalty situation. He never goes into how my impacts don't hit. He just specifically says that it's not warranted because he's not an individual. You vote the policy in, that's what you, or if you vote his, not policy, if you vote his theory, then that's what you're saying. Two, he goes to the erotic situation and how I said that leads to offensive. He never touches that in his last speech. So you're specifically going to see how the eroticism still being offensive in any ways does happen, and it can be considered offensive. Two, he just said to kids to avert your eyes. One, you're not going to buy this argumentation because kids ask the darndest questions. If they see that, they can say, what is that? Why is that happening? Where do babies come from? There's lots of things that can logistically advocate from this. You can't just tell a kid to ignore something. That's like saying, hey kid, don't touch that puppy. They want to touch the puppy. When you tell them not to look at something, they want to look at it even more. So the parenting argumentation that I have turns on both sides, and that's going to exist specifically in this debate. Two, we go into this whole, again, this probability. I guess it's a little different, US versus Australia. Most cafes and Starbucks and things I go to do have bathrooms, and it's the advocation of this. But again, this is the basis of policy, as he is saying, so we're not debating the probability. We're debating, should this happen? We have to have bathrooms. We have to have fire codes. We have to have these things, and these businesses have to make that happen to make it work. We are debating, should that happen? Besides monetary, he's shown no impacts about how this is going to make businesses go under. He's shown no impacts about how this is going to hurt different businesses. So at at the end of the day, we specifically see that this should be an alternative to make people not offended and not upset in these situations. Then we look to the 1/3 argumentation again, and he says that it's a society norm. And he says, I have no evidence or no link to show that it's not a society norm. Neither does he. That's my situation. He can't use this 1/3 argumentation to specifically say that it is because of the pressure, because he doesn't have that link either. It's because they feel, it's at the end of the day, it's that they are embarrassed and they do feel it's inappropriate to do, and that's why we need to give them alternatives and options to do it.
Well, look, if you think that I was supposed to defend communism in a breastfeeding motion, you should give the debate to him.
Going on why you should vote. 1, you should vote that the link doesn't happen. 2, you should vote that even if you don't buy that argument and don't buy the link, I've shown how the erotic happened.